And we wouldn't be live streaming and doing what we're doing today without, taking a tip to the hat to these fellas here for doing that. So without any further ado, here is Brother Joe Martinez.
Good afternoon. Hope everyone had a good lunch and not too sleepy. I promise I won't bore you. So let's get right to it. So what I'm going to talk about today is how to improve your lodge by reading the minutes as slowly and as painfully as possible. Yeah. Woo!
You said you were going to read the short talk bulletin.
I could after. It's a short one. So I am. So just wanted to wake everybody up. That is not what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about one of those tangential things that Brother Scott talked about. So oops, if I bring the slide up. So what we're going to talk about today is the Osirian myths and its connection to Freemasonry. And I will try to be as relevant as humanly possible to appease Brother Scott. So let me begin by saying that it's going to be very, very difficult to condense 4,000 years of history and mythology into a 30 or 40-minute presentation. But I'm going to do my best to attempt to do so as quickly and as painlessly as I can. So for starters, some of you are here wondering why we're talking about Egyptian stuff at a conference that has to do with Freemasonry. Well, I'm going to go ahead and ruin the surprise for you all. The creation myths of many, many ancient cultures, some that existed before the time of recorded history, or what we call prehistory, and more specifically, the myths surrounding Osiris, are very, very familiar to those who've never read or heard those stories before. They've just been retold to you or repackaged in many different and altered forms. So the story of creation, the story of a slain king, and the story of a lost secret for you all have been repackaged and reinvented across the centuries. And although slightly different each and every time you hear it, it still has those same markers in each retelling that make it easy to see that these stories span the borders of nations as well as the divisions of centuries and millennia throughout recorded history. So maybe there's a common thread somewhere. So I want to take one brief second to discuss how we're going to use the term mythology in this presentation. So the term mythology has a negative connotation in the modern sense when you hear it used in conversations nowadays. People nowadays use the word to describe magical and fanciful and flat out false tales of the past that have no historical or cultural lasting significance. And that's just flat out untrue. At its face, the word mythology, when used by scholars, is used as it's originally intended. Taken from the Greek word mythos, which literally means story of the people, its lexical definition is, and I quote, the study and interpretation of often sacred tales or stories which deal with various aspects of the human condition. Or it is a collection of stories in oral and written form, especially one belonging to a particular religious or cultural tradition. So we can use the term mythology, and it can be used correctly to discuss the stories of the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, the Islamic tradition, or any other religious system. It doesn't have to have that negative or make-believe connotation that we normally subscribe to it. So what we're going to discuss today is a brief history of the Egyptian mythos, the different places where it came from, and yes, it did come from different places, the story surrounding the creation of the world, or their creation narrative, perhaps how it's similar to some other stories you may have heard in the past, the story of the first god king Osiris, his transmission of knowledge and science and enlightenment to the world, his life, his death, his rebirth. Again, we're going to touch on how this story influences many tales that came later, what they mean to us and to people around us, and how they should resonate at least a tiny bit with the modern Freemason. So I hope that you'll find at least a tiny nugget of something interesting in the next 30 minutes. So to begin with the ancient Egyptian history, we have to look at the pre and proto-dynastic periods. So those are times before the first dynasty in Egypt, from about 10,000 BCE to about 4,000 BCE. And then the rise of the different major city centers that rose in ancient Egypt. So the proto-dynastic period was marked by a few major additions to human civilization. The first hieroglyphics, the first use of stone palettes for communicating, the regular use of sterex or early cartouches, and everybody knows what a cartouche is, the first royal cemeteries, and the invention of advanced sail navigation, the ability to sail the ocean. That started in Egypt. So from this transmission of written language that we found, because they love to write about things, we found numerous creation myths, and more notably, the myths of Osiris, which arose a little bit differently across a few major branches across the entire kingdom of Egypt. So we have to understand that the overall construct that we now and the History Channel calls the ancient Egyptian religion arose a tiny bit differently across different major centers of civilization throughout the entire kingdom. It was just not one story that was perpetuated forward. It was a bunch of different stories that we kind of smushed together and put on the History Channel. So it depended really on which family reigned at the time, which gods were given more credence and importance, which area of the nation held more political or i.e. priestly power, and other factors. So there were a few major city centers throughout the kingdom of Egypt, and these major city centers were originally called Iunu, which meant the pillars, Nebuchadnezzar, which meant the white walls, Wasit, the city of the scepter, and Kamenu, also known as Eight Town. So these different stories of creation and the birth of the Egyptian dynasty had some major commonalities and were later merged into a more or less unified religious story by the Second Intermediate and New Kingdom time period, so around 1670 to 1550 BCE. It's also of note that with the rise of the Ptolemaic dynasties, the dynasties that came from Hellenized Greek people, the original Egyptian religious ideas that we're going to talk about were merged with later Greek culture and religion and mythology, and in my opinion, heavily watered down their religious practices for the rest of the ancient Egyptian historical time period. So let's start with Iunu, also known as Heliopolis. And Heliopolis is the Latinized form of the Greek name Heliopolis, which meant city of the sun. So you have Helios, the personified and deified form of the sun, was identified with the Greeks with the Egyptian god Ra, or Atum, whose principal cult center was located in that city. The city also appears in the Old Kingdom pyramid texts as the House of Ra, or the House of the Sun. Next one we have is Nebuchadnezzar, or Memphis. Now, Memphis had many, many names during its history of almost 4 millennia. Its ancient Egyptian name was Nebuchadnezzar, which meant the white walls. Memphis became the capital of ancient Egypt for over 8 consecutive dynasties throughout the Old Kingdom time period. The city reached a peak of prestige during the 6th dynasty, as a center for the worship of Ra, or Ptah in some cases, the god of creation and artwork. Later replacing the Ogdoad in many other Egyptian myth narratives. And I mentioned the Ogdoad because we're going to go into more detail on who these guys were. So the White Walls, by tradition, were founded by Menes, the first king of a unified Egypt. So Egypt, way back before the dynasties, was split into Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. And Menes, the first king, unified those two lands by tradition. They weren't called pharaoh yet. Pharaoh was a later invention brought by the Greeks, and it's actually a Greek word, which meant king. And it wasn't really in use until the New Kingdom time period, so much, much later. It's likely that Menes, the first king of that unified Egypt, established himself there to better control this new union between two rival kingdoms that fought for hundreds of years. And then lastly, we have, I skipped one. We have Wasit, or Thebes, and you guys have heard that city, also known as the city of the scepter of the pharaohs. So Thebes was always a major city center for ancient Egypt, and it contained the famous Temple of Luxor, the traditional temple for kingmaking for many, many dynasties. And it was the capital of the kingdom on and off for many, many centuries. Lastly, we have Kamenu, or Hermopolis. And that was the Egyptian language name of that city, and it meant 8 town after the Ogdoad. And the Ogdoad were a group of 8 primordial deities whose cult was situated there. The city was later named by the Greeks the city of Hermes, since the Greeks identified Hermes with Thoth, because Thoth was the Egyptian god of magic and healing and wisdom and the patron of scribes. And he wrote those awesome emerald tablets that you can buy on eBay for $200. So what the Ogdoad are and what they signify is a good segue into the actual ancient Egyptian creation narrative. So one of the most popular Egyptian creation myths, the myths coming from the city of Hermopolis, start with the story of the Ogdoad. So the Ogdoad were also known as the Infinities, and they were the celestial rulers of the cosmic age, not the terrestrial gods that we're going to talk about later. They were considered to have come long before the Egyptian religious system that we currently recognize, started probably before the first dynasty. And the Ogdoad were concerned with the preservation of the celestial world, and later, as we'll see, the formation of the human race. Though their power among the Egyptian people was most widely recognized during the Old Kingdom, so around 2600 BCE to 2100 BCE, traces of this pantheon made its way all the way down to the next set of gods. So they became very similar to the Titans of Greek mythology. And if you're familiar with Greek mythology, the Titans created the Olympian gods, and they kind of went by the wayside. So the Ogdoad predate the more commonly known Egyptian gods, such as Osiris, Isis, Anubis, Thoth. They were considered to have come into creation before the world did, so they pre-existed creation to the Egyptians. And the Ogdoad consisted of 4 couples, or 8 deities, who balance one another and the nature of the cosmos. So each pair correlated with one of the primordial forces of creation of the universe in the ancient Egyptian belief system. So things like water and air and light and time. The 3 primary pairs, Nu, Nanuet, Hehu, Kekui, Kekuit, were always named as such, no matter what text you read in ancient Egypt. The 4th pair had a little bit of different variations to it, and the most common of these was Amun and Amunet. So in the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, it was believed that Nu and Nanuet were responsible for the development of the primordial waters of the universe. Primordial water sounds a bit familiar. We've heard that in other stories, haven't we? So Amun and Amunet were caretakers of the air, while Kekui and Kekuet were keepers of darkness. And finally, Hehu and Hehuet were responsible for maintaining eternity and infinity. So they had a pretty big job. So each first name in this group of 8 is always the male avatar, while the second is female. So even in pre-dynastic Egypt, they had an equal balance of genders in their early pantheon. And so they were kind of progressive for their time. So there's several views from the Egyptians that emanated from the time of the worship of the Ogdoad as to how the world they knew it came into creation. The most popular was that the Ogdoad created an egg in the primordial waters from which the world was born. It was considered to be invisible at the time because before creation, there was no sun, there was no light. Until the day that this cosmic egg hatched and out came the brilliant golden light of the newly born sun. And we've heard cosmic egg in some other mythologies and other stories that you've heard as well. So this form of the sun was named Ra, one of the only Egyptian deities to have been accepted both by the traditional Ogdoad followers and the followers of the later religious systems of the time. So Ra, or Atum, which is interchangeable, is that common point between these 2 different religious systems that we find in ancient Egypt. So we have these pre-existence deities, and it's at this point in the story, most of the myths converge with the story of the actual creation of the world and mankind. So for the rest of the story, we're going to focus on the popular meldings of Ra and Atum. We're just going to make them interchangeable. So once upon a time, sorry, I left the sound on, but that's the ocean. So once upon a time, before there was land, fish, animals, or human life, there was this great expansion of primordial waters that encompassed the entire universe. Nothing existed in these primordial waters since the beginning of time, until the great egg appeared in the water. This cosmic egg, which we've heard before, contained Ra, which represented the daytime sun. So once his egg hatched, he burst forth into the universe and took his place as its great ruler. In other narratives, the journey began with the creation of the world and the universe out of darkness and swirling chaos. Once there was nothing but endless, dark, formless void without form or purpose. Again, where have we heard that before? Existing within this void was the god of magic who awaited for that moment of creation. So this creation moment came when this primordial hill, known as the Benben, burst forth from the primordial waters, and upon it stood Ra or Atum. So this is a picture, if you've ever seen obelisks. Obelisks in ancient Egypt all had on top of them a capstone called the Benben, or a pyramidion, which symbolized that first point of creation breaking forth into the sky. So kind of like Washington, D.C., the tallest things that were in Egypt for a good period of time were obelisks. In D.C., you can't build anything taller than 12 stories, and they kind of did this too. So, I already said that. So Atum looked upon the nothingness of creation and recognized that he was really alone. So through magic, because there was nobody else, he mated with his own shadow. Sounds kind of lonely. To give birth to two children. Shu, the god of air, whom Atum spat out, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture, whom Atum vomited out. And those of you that have ever sat in a sex magic talk, which is really tangential stuff for Scott, there's other versions of the story where other things happened where Tefnut came out. So we're going to skip. Yeah. So Shu, I didn't put their names on there. So Shu's the dude and Tefnut is the lady. So Shu gave the early world the principles of life, while Tefnut contributed to the principles of order. So this order is what would come to be known as Mat in Egyptian society. And it really became an overarching theme for the Egyptian kingdom society throughout most of the dynastic period. So Mat represented ethical and moral principles that every Egyptian citizen was expected to follow throughout their entire daily lives. So it wasn't just some BS that they talked about. They lived it and they breathed it, and it became part of their culture. So Mat, because of that concept of Mat, they were expected to act with honor and truth in matters that involved their family, the community, the nation, the environment, and even their interaction with their gods. The significance of Mat developed to the point that it embraced all aspects of existence for them. So things like the equilibrium of the universe and light and dark and all these polarizing concepts, they all surrounded this concept of Mat. And it permeated how they thought the cycles of the seasons ran, the movements of the stars in the night sky, their religious observances, and honesty and truthfulness in their social interaction with others. So Mat pervaded every bit of Egyptian culture for millennia, and it wasn't a fleeting thing. So back to Shu and Tefnut. They left their father on the Benben, and they went out to create the world. So in time, Atum became worried because they had been gone for so long, and he missed his children. So, Ra did what every normal dad does: is he removed his eye and sent it out and searched for them. So while the eye was gone, Atum sat alone on the hill and in the midst of all this chaos and contemplated eternity. But finally, Shu and Tefnut returned with the eye of Ra. Or in some places, it's also called the all-seeing eye. And their father, grateful for their safe return, did what any father would do, shed tears of joy. And these tears dropping onto the dark, fertile little mound of the Benben gave birth to men and women. So you and me, yay. So these human beings had nowhere to live. So Shu and Tefnut mated and gave birth to Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. So Geb and Nut, even though brother and sister, fell deeply in love and were inseparable. Now, Atum did not like this behavior and thought it was super unacceptable. So he pushed Nut away from Geb, high up into the heavens. So these two starstruck lovers were forever able to see each other, but no longer able to touch. Interestingly enough, Nut, the goddess of the sky, formed a starry deck canopy over her husband, the earth. This also sounds familiar to the earth and heavens being separated in other creation narratives. But before they were separated, sneaky Geb and Nut conceived and later had 4 children. They had 2 sons and 2 daughters. The sons were Set and Osiris, and the daughters were Isis and Nephthys. Like their parents before them, they fell in love too. There's a lot of weird brother-sister love going on in Egypt. Osiris and Isis fell in love, and Set and Nephthys fell in love. So it's in the pyramid text at the Pyramid of Teti in Saqqara, which were written around 2400 to 2300 BCE, that we pick up one of the most comprehensive narratives of the Osirian myth. So after their grandfather Ra passed on, Osiris was called to succeed Ra as the ruler of the universe. So he became the god of fertility and agriculture and vegetation and life. And soon, as we'll see in a bit, he also became the god of the afterlife and the resurrection and rebirth to the ancient Egyptian religious system. So after his coronation as ruler of the universe, he traveled to the world bringing science and agriculture and language to all the corners of the globe. As with other religions that had initiatory rites, a transmission of divine knowledge was done so by Osiris, and he was credited with bringing civilization to the human beings that his father Ra created. He married his sister Isis, who later became queen of the universe and his royal consort. So Set, sorry I found such a doofy picture, but Set was the brother of Osiris and the god of deserts and storms and fire and war and famines and basically all the yucky things in life. So Set and Osiris didn't get along after Osiris was chosen over Set to rule the entire universe. Set didn't like his brother becoming master of all creation and felt that he should be ruler instead of his brother. So his anger was fueled even further when Osiris made plans to depart to spread light and wisdom and knowledge and science throughout the world, that he made his sister wife Isis the regent of all Egypt instead of bestowing the power to his brother Set. He was a little pissed off. So Set had a very, very terrible temper, and he vowed to kill his brother and take the power that he considered to be rightfully his. Upon Osiris's return to Egypt after he spread light and enlightenment to the whole world, Set plotted to destroy his brother. So Set secretly took the measurements of Osiris while he slept one night, got all the measurements of his body like a tailor does, and had a beautiful cedarwood and ebony and gold chest made for him, which was fitted to Osiris's exact specifications. He then announced a banquet honoring his brother's return and invited the whole pantheon of the Egyptian gods to this feast. So during this feast, everybody was eating and drinking and doing Egyptian god things. And he took this beautiful chest out and offered the chest to anyone who could fit inside the chest perfectly. So all the Egyptian gods tried. None of them were fit. They were too small, too big, too fat, too skinny. Nobody could fit. And the last person left to try was Osiris. So when he laid down in the chest, which had been made to fit him and him only, Set and his followers slammed on the lid and nailed it down. And he then sealed it by pouring molten lead into all the cavities and threw it into the river Nile. So obviously Isis, his sister wife, was a little sad about this, and she couldn't bear to be without her beloved Osiris. Isis's grief was so great that even her sister and Set's wife, Nephthys, helped Isis search for her king. So while they were out searching, Set usurped Osiris's rule and reigned over the land, and he neglected his people and all of his gifts, and the land suffered drought and famine and war and death and disease. Oops. Oh, there we go. So the chest was swept out to the sea and landed on the coast near Byblos. The instant it touched land near Byblos, a huge tamarisk tree sprouted up to protect it. And we'll talk about the tamarisk a little bit later. The tree grew so large that the king of Byblos trimmed this tree down and fashioned it into a pillar in his palace. Isis finally tracked down the body of Osiris to the land of Byblos and persuaded the king to give her the pillar. Notably, this pillar that contained Osiris was also known as the Jed pillar. And you may have heard that pillar name before, which symbolized the spine of Osiris. And here you see with the crook and flail that's common to depictions of the god king. So she took her husband's corpse back to Egypt and communed with Anubis to prepare the body for the first ever mummification. When they left the body unattended, however, Set stole his body and became so enraged that he dismembered it and broke it up into sometimes 14 or other times 42 pieces and scattered the body parts all throughout the land of Egypt. Isis was a little bit more distraught than she was before, and she again enlisted the help of her sister Nephthys. So they scoured Egypt and looked for all the body parts, and they found all but one of the pieces. So the missing part was, of course, his phallus, which was apparently swallowed by a fish that was loyal to Set. So Isis and Nephthys mourned over the dead body of their brother, and Ra took pity on them. He sent Anubis to prepare Osiris for, again, the first ever mummification, and instructed Thoth, Isis, and Nephthys to piece the body back together. Isis transformed into a small bird and breathed life into him. But it wasn't sufficient for him to take his place back among the living, but it was just enough to give his body life enough for her to conceive a son through union. So this child was born and hidden from Set and was named Horus. Osiris was revived, but could no longer be among the living since he was not whole. And like we said, he was missing his phallus, so he wasn't a complete being. And because of that, he couldn't stay on earth anymore. and that he would have to descend to the underworld and reign there as the Lord of the Dead. So Osiris left for the underworld, and Isis went into hiding in the Delta region of Egypt to protect herself and her son Set. So Isis gave birth to Horus alone in the swamps of the Delta. She hid herself and her son from Set and his demons in the thickets, and only going out at night for food, accompanied by sometimes scorpions or sometimes eagles, a whole bunch of different magical creatures that would protect them. So they basically lived there in exile, and Isis and Nephthys and Thoth nurtured Horus and educated him during that exile until he was grown enough to manhood and strong enough to challenge his uncle for his father's kingdom. So once Horus grew to adulthood, he returned and confronted the entire Egyptian pantheon about his heritage and challenged his uncle for the right to reclaim the throne that was rightfully his. Sometimes this contest involved the challenge of the mind or wits involving puzzles to solve. In others, it involved Horus slaying Set and losing an eye, which would later become the very famous Eye of Horus. And in others still, Horus would defeat Set, not slay him, and Set would find redemption by sailing on the sun barge with his father Ra to fight the serpent Apophis each and every night. So Ra was the god of the sun, and Apophis was the lord of chaos. And Ra would defeat Apophis so that the sun would rise each and every day. So having conquered Set finally and restoring order to all of Egypt, Horus became known as the uniter of the two lands. And that's where the beginning of the dynastic period starts. The lower and the upper kingdoms of Egypt were united under his rule. He reinstated all the policies of his mother and father, rejuvenated the land, and ruled wisely for a very long time. So it's for this reason that the kings of Egypt, from the first dynastic period onward, aligned themselves with Horus and chose a Horus name to rule under at their coronation and initiation ceremony. Osiris had been the first king of Egypt and established order, and then passed on to the underworld by Horus, his son, was the king that restored that order after it was overturned by Set. Egyptian kings, therefore, from that moment forward, identified themselves with Horus in life and Osiris in death. During their reign, they were the physical manifestation of Horus, and at the moment of their death, during the burial ceremony, they traveled to the underworld to join with Osiris. So back to Osiris for a second. Instead of coming back to life fully, he traveled to the underworld, a dark and desolate place. But Ra, his father, reassured him that he would find peace and contentment as the Lord of the Dead. And his son Horus would rule over the living until Ra decided to unmake his creation and return everything to that nothingness from whence it came. So when Egyptian kings passed on, they would travel after being prepared using the proper rituals to the land of the dead to sit with Osiris. Similar ritualistic practices would assist the new king-to-be to transform from just a man, or in some places a woman, to a god-man in the form of the new Horus. So again, there's that dual practice or rite in the king-making ceremonies of ancient Egypt. There is a ceremony for the deceased king and also one for his progeny. So this newly crowned king, a physical personification of Horus on earth, would reign. Upon his death, he would undergo that ritual where he would be prepared for that journey to the underworld. And during that time, which was most oftentimes, according to the pyramid text, 70 days, his heir would undergo the ceremonies needed to transform him into the new Horus. It's this story and this creation myth that established the divine right of rule for the Egyptian dynasties all the way up through the Ptolemaic period. So let's talk about some themes. So some themes that we talked about and that we're going to talk about are allegory. Obviously, a lot of what I'm talking to you about is allegory. So stories that are meant to impart meaning about the human condition. We talked about a tragic murder, and we're going to talk about another tragic murder in a bit. Hidden wisdom that's imparted from a deified form to the common man. Multiple burials. You may have heard stories about people being buried more than once. That transmission of knowledge of that hidden wisdom from one group of people to another. Initiation rites and practices. So just to get to the meat and potatoes of this presentation, there were initiation rites and practices in both the deceased king being passed on to the afterlife and the newly made king as he was being deified. And that search for something lost. I think everybody in this room may have been on their own journey for something lost. And we're going to start with Albert Mackey. And he gives us his thoughts on the ritualistic mysteries of Egypt and their connection to craft masonry in Mackey's Encyclopedia in the 1875 edition. And I quote, "Egypt has always been considered as the birthplace of the mysteries. It was there that the ceremonies of initiation were first established. It was there that truth, first veiled in allegory, and the dogmas of religion were first imparted under symbolic forms. From Egypt, the land of the tongued globe, the land of science and philosophy, peerless for stately tombs and magnificent temples, the land whose civilization was old and a nation before most other nations. Since then called an empire, this system of symbols was disseminated through Greece and Rome and other countries of Europe and Asia, giving origin through many intermediate steps to that mysterious association, which is now represented by the institution of Freemasonry." So don't take my word for it, take Mackey's. So let's navigate through some of those themes found in both systems, the ancient Egyptian mystery rituals and modern Freemasonry. So we arrive first at the concept of the trinity of people who play a central part in each story in both of these epic allegories. And again, allegory is that expression of truth about our human existence by means of symbolic figures and their actions in that story. So again, we have trinities in both. In craft masonry, we have Solomon, king of Israel, Hiram, king of Tyre, and Hiram Abiff. In the Egyptian mystery rituals, we have Osiris, Isis, and their son Horus. In both of these tales, we have, if the slides will show, a tragic murder. So both of these stories, the story of Osiris and the story of Hiram Abiff, involve tragic and sudden murders of really extraordinary people taken well before their time. The antagonists in each story have their own reasons for, doing this, whether it's envy or greed or spite, or even a combination of all of these. There's a lot of symbolism to unpack in both the motives of Set and his accomplices and the three ruffians in the Hiramic legend. Secret mysteries and knowledge. So hidden wisdom is kept by both of the protagonists in this story. Osiris keeps the secrets of the universe, of science, of enlightened wisdom, only to be passed on through the mysteries to his successors. And Hiram, in the speculative craft, keeps the secrets of a master mason, neither one imparting them before their untimely death. So burial and reburial, multiple burials. Both of the protagonists experience multiple burials. Osiris is buried in the chest, then dismembered, then undergoes the first mummification required to complete his rebirth. And we have in earlier Masonic documents the reburial and secrets of Noah and his three sons, which some of you may be familiar with. And then we also have Hiram hastily buried and then reburied according to the Masonic customs and traditions of that age. We have a transmission of knowledge at the point of resurrection. So at that point of ritualistic initiation. Osiris, through the magic of Isis, transmits his secret knowledge as well as his seed, which gives rise to his son Horus. There were also initiatic practices for the hierophants or the priests as they prepared to do the work of the gods. And you got to remember, the priests were really important parts of ancient Egyptian culture. In the other story, Master Masons know at which point in the allegory they receive this secret wisdom, or at least are shown the doorway to the beginning of this secret wisdom. So initiation rites flourish in both of these stories. For Osiris and Horus, there's that initiatic rite where each deceased king merges with Osiris, and the new king-to-be undergoes the secret initiations of not only king-making, but God-making, or apotheosis. In Freemasonry, the rites of initiation are meant to prepare us for a life not of the mundane, but of the celestial and the eternal. So we have that search for something lost. So both allegories contain a treasure lost forever with a substitute at the end until the real treasure is discovered. Some people think that those that do talks on sex magic and things like that, they'll tell you that the thing that was lost was the phallus in the Osirian myth. But I think it's the divine right of rule and the God aspects of ourselves that's the thing that's lost, which is reclaimed by Horus and all of his descendants through initiation by way of the phallus. I've never said phallus so much before in my entire life. Phallus. So in Freemasonry, we know what's lost and what's substituted in its place, leaving us with that lifelong quest for discovery. But is it really as mundane as a word, though? Or does that word mean something much more? Is it an allegory within an allegory? I think our host, Brother Robert Johnson can probably enlighten you on that way better than I can. So get with him after this presentation. So what does this all mean for us, and why do we care? Some of you are probably thinking that right now. It means that there's absolutely some symbolism that we should take from the stories of Egypt and her mysteries when discussing the purpose and practice of Freemasonic ritual. Transmission of these practices survived in their own vacuum for thousands of years, then permeated Hellenized culture with the coming of Alexander the Great, then migrated to Roman culture, and was passed in hushed corners and tones to future initiatic systems from the Dark Ages to the Age of Enlightenment. The most striking things to me after researching ancient Egyptian rituals are the similarities that we find that are glossed over in ritual and practice each and every day. So we have a slain hero who takes with him a secret or knowledge to the grave, or who receives a gift from a goddess, most notably a virgin. Osiris was slain, and Isis came along, put his pieces back together, except his phallus, which was replaced with a golden one. The phallus here was the means by which the gift of the goddess was transmitted, or the gift was the divine birth of a son, to a virgin, I might add, since Isis did not have a child before Osiris died, to carry on that dynastic rule for all of Egypt. This gift in other stories also takes similar forms. So the stories of King Arthur also show that he was defeated and his sword was broken, and a phallic symbol. The Lady of the Lake gave him a new one, the famous Excalibur. He then completed his monomyth journey, as legend tells us. And actually, the symbolism is quite consistent in the story if you read it, as the Black Knight also lost his manhood, or his phallus, in this story as well. Percival, you may have heard of him, that new young knight seeking out the Grail. When he visits the castle of the wounded Fisher King, ton of symbolism in that sentence right there. Go Google that. He sees a lance and a grail. The lance here is another gift in phallic form. And the list goes on and on. Stories throughout the millennia that all tell a similar tale. So finally, we come to the story and grave of Hiram Abiff, the twice buried son of a widow who kept a secret very close to his heart, which caused his untimely death, and set into motion a discovery for that which was lost. Be it a word or a formula or some divine secret entrusted to a select few, Hiram took with him to the grave this secret knowledge in the face of death, and is rewarded with a raising and a reburial, which culminates his journey of birth, death, and raising. This raising ceremony completes his monomyth saga, and it begins our search when we go through that process for truth and light, things we refer to as wisdom and enlightenment in Freemasonry. The most striking similarity that I found, or dare I say connection between these two, is this most famous of Masonic symbols. First committed to print in the early 1800s, which clearly shows striking similarities between the story of Hiram and the story of Osiris, if we know where to look. So what do we have here? Let's ask Albert Pike in Morals and Dogma. And he's going to tell us, and I quote, "Masonry still retains among its emblems one of a woman weeping over a broken column, holding in her hand a branch of acacia or myrtle or tamarisk, while time, we are told, stands behind her combing out the ringlets of her hair. We need not repeat this trivial explanation given of this representation of Isis weeping at Byblos over the column torn from the palace of the king that contained the body of Osiris, while Horus, the god of time, pours ambrosia on her hair." So again, don't take my word for it. Listen to Pike and Mackey. So finally, we have the circumstances of the rebirth or the resurrection. Hiram's hasty grave was opened, and then he was reburied in a place of honor in full Masonic ceremony. He was raised in a very particular way, using a particular manner or ritual, which I'm not going to get into further, and which is performed to every Mason that goes through the degrees. Coincidentally enough, some of the pyramid texts tell us that the body of Osiris is raised on the 7th day after his death, which is symbolic to many solar myth stories. And solar myth stories is a whole nother presentation. And that he was raised in the astrological sign of Leo. Which should strike us Freemasons as being very, very, very familiar to us. So the Osirian myth is about the redemption and reintegration of the soul. A king with the wisdom of the universe, imparting it unto the world, is cut down by jealousy and greed at the very height of his power, unable to complete that task. So through a mystical ceremony of initiation and ritual, he's given new life by Isis, who is able to revive him long enough to conceive an heir. and guarantee her husband's place as the lord of the underworld for all time. Most notably in this is the fact that Isis conceives her son after the death of her husband, which effectively makes Horus the son of a widow. Synesius, the Greek Christian bishop of the early church, points out that there was evidence enough of elaborate and secretive king-making rituals, an initiation that would take a man or a woman and transform them into the personification of Horus on earth. Plutarch also notes in his essays on the Egyptians that from the conflict of Osiris and Set, we're to understand the constant warfare between the constructive and destructive principles of our nature, the struggle between dark and light, good and evil, both within ourselves and within the world around us. So Osiris becomes that prototype for order and beauty and harmony, and Set of disorder and asymmetry and disharmony. Brother Manly Hall also describes the Egyptian mysteries as containing the ancient allegories found within Freemasonry. He notes that, and I quote, "The phallus, being the symbol of the vital power and so used in many Egyptian hieroglyphs, the phallus then is the lost word, which is not discovered, but for which a golden replica is substituted. This replica produced the divine child Horus, who completes the hero's journey for his father." He also notes that the greatest minds of antiquity all made the trek to ancient Egypt at some point in their lives to learn the mysteries and the sciences. People like Thales and Solon and Plato and Democritus and Pythagoras and Plutarch, just to name a few. And this was something that would not have been done by so many if there was little more than veiled mysticism and card tricks to be found there. So Osiris's journey from creation, life, death, and rebirth is the story of at-one-ment or atonement with that absolute, that search for light that people still make to this day, a search for the divine in all of us and that divinity all around us. And that search began on a path, in my opinion, that was laid before us at least as far back as the time of Isis and Osiris. Thank you for your time. No phallus questions.
All right. Well, that's what we want.
You did say it was a board member.
Yes.
It was hilarious. We did have a little bit of a disco party because you had such stark whites and blacks in some of your slides. The autofocus on the camera was like white, darker, light. So
No worries.
So anyway, we're still waiting on some questions.
No worries.
Also, we have Q&A coming in. Do we have questions in the audience?
Fine.
Cleopatra's Needle.
Cleopatra's Needle is an obelisk that was taken from Egypt and brought to New York.
So you know the contents, and can you connect it to any of this?
I'm
I'm trying to be nice for the microphone, but you don't.
So the question was asked about Cleopatra's Needle and if I know any of the significance of it. I will totally get back to you on that, but I do know that there is some stuff on there that is relevant to our story.
So the quick version is when you opened it up, there's a whole lodge in Pennsylvania that has a program about it. It's actually really interesting. There's all this Masonic stuff: square, compass, level, a white stone, a black stone. You know, that really ties into what you're talking about. And I was just curious if there were any things.
Awesome. So for the people, oh, wow, that was loud. So for the people online, Brother Jeremy talked about Cleopatra's Needle and how when they, and the Grand Lodge, you said Pennsylvania has a lecture on it.
When they opened it for shipping to bring it to the U.S. from Egypt, they found all this stuff that is like practically Masonic.
Oh, fantastic. Yes, sir.
How, like, it obviously is what is challenge for people who want to do education that is possibly deeper without being capable.
Tangential, yes.
That sounds almost bad. How do you start the process of putting together a presentation like this? Somewhere else?
Sure.
You went somewhere that is deep, but helping to room people who might not want to talk about valid things.
Right. So the question was, and I'm rephrasing it for the folks online. What led me to this presentation, and thank you. How was I able to give it and keep the attention and basically kind of keep it ground level for a lot of folks. And I'm actually going to go back to some of the things that Brother Scott said, because I jokingly told him, I was like, well, thank you for having me go after you with a tangential presentation, and not get to the meat and potatoes. But it kind of goes back to what is it that you find through that contemplative act that you do. You know, I do consider myself a contemplative Mason. And for me, the thing that I like to read and pray about and then contemplate and meditate on is the whole initiatic practice that we do. For many people, and unfortunately many Freemasons, it's really a surface practice. There's no deep meaning to it. You know, some people are super unfortunate and get to, or told to experience it all in a one-day practice. It doesn't make them a bad Mason, but it does give them a bad initiatic experience. And I think that the initiatic experience is something that separates us from your Moose Lodges, from your Elks, from your Kiwanis clubs, things like that. Because it's supposed to impart lessons of mortality to you. And it's not something that people talk about. And you're actually going to hear a little bit about it from my daughter tomorrow, about lessons of mortality. You know, people our age and younger don't talk about mortality and why it's important, and why you have to do something with that finite time that you have here. Because when we're young, we think we live forever. But I think that the initiatic practices, especially those found in Freemasonry, as they're supposed to be done, do impart that lesson and give us that pause that we need. It's like, well, shit, I got to stop what I'm doing and think about my life and think about my actions and think about what it is I do to the world around me. And maybe from that, I become a bit of a better person. So to answer your question, I always do. So I like to talk about this stuff, if you haven't noticed. But for me, I never want to be that guy in the front of the room that goes over your head and bores the crap out of you. That's not my purpose here. So maybe that's why I probably said phallus way too much. But I did not say wiener. So, but yeah, but if I can at least make it sound a little bit interesting and pique your curiosity a little bit, then I did my job.
Brother Joe, I have a question online. This is Brother Kevin Standin, who's been watching all day from Washington. He says, can you recommend a comprehensive resource to learn more about the Osirian mythos?
Ooh. Brother Scott is staring at me really hard because I'm going to make a recommendation for a book list. Ooh, awesome. What would you recommend? The Initiatic Experience? That is so The Initiatic Experience by Robert Hurd is a fantastic book. Mine is dog-eared all to hell. And I think you can get it on Amazon. Don't cringe. If you purchase a copy of The Lost Keys by Manly Hall, don't read The Lost Keys, but he's got a little extra segment in the back about the Egyptian mysteries. That's a fun read. Some of the stuff he says is a little weird, but it's a fun little read. But skip the whole first part until you've gotten through morals and dogma, like Brother Scott said. So,
Can I ask you to tell everybody about the book that you had recommended for a lot of initiatic experiences? The white book, I think. White cover, dealt with a lot of initiatic paths or something.
The Eliade book?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, so there is I think he was a French author. His name is Mirceau Eliade, and he writes about, I'll make sure I get it to RJ so that he can email all of you. He writes lots of books about ancient initiation rituals and the rites behind them, but he goes ancient Egypt to the Greeks to Aborigines in Australia and everything in between. And he really does a fantastic job of unpacking all of that and finding that common thread amongst all these different peoples. Yes, sir.
So what do you think about people who style themselves Masonic scholars try to create a narrative that former Freemasonry stems from the establishment of the Green Lodge and all of that?
That wasn't a loaded question at all. So So to rephrase for the folks, what is my thoughts on people who believe that speculative Freemasonry started in 1717 with the Grand Lodge of England? Is that fair to say? Okay. So my thoughts on it are speculative Freemasonry did start around, 1717 in the formalized way that we see it today. But initiatic systems existed for many centuries before that. And like I said, the more I read and the more I think about it, I do see a common thread. Or do I say that craft masonry is a direct result of the ancient Egyptian mysteries? Absolutely not, because we don't know what they all are. A lot of them were not written down. That's why they're called mysteries. People who read about the Eleusinian mysteries, they were really good at keeping secrets. We suck at it, okay? And so all you hear is written context from people that were either disgruntled about it or heard about it from a second party. But they were really good at keeping secrets about their initiation rituals. So it's probably not an answer to your question, but do I think there's a direct lineage between the two? Maybe not, but I think the spirit of it is there. The purpose of it is there. And I think really at its core, I think apotheosis really is a part of what our craft is teaching us, how to find that divine within us. Because we're so, as a people, we're so mundane and we're so concerned with, in general, I'm not saying the people in this room, you guys are awesome. We're so concerned, just like Dago said in his presentation, we're so concerned with the crap that we buy and the clothes that we wear and the car that we drive. We don't think about that spark of divinity inside of us that often. And I think Freemasonry carries on that tradition, or at least it should, to help us realize that a little bit more. So hopefully I answered your question.
Brother Joe, I have a question that actually comes from one of our folks on the Grand Lodge Committee who was watching.
Oh, no.
You ready?
No. I'm in trouble.
Brother Chris Garlington, better known as Bull Garlington, says, regarding the correlation between Osiris and Freemasonry, so what?
Great.
How does that knowledge have application other than feeding curiosity?
Well, I can, so for Brother Bull, thank you for that question. So the question was regarding, I was recited for the interwebs. So the question that was asked was, so you're talking about the myth of Osiris and how it relates to Freemasonry, and basically, so what? What's the point in all of that? Well, I can answer that question for me, and you can take or leave the answer, but for me, it's, our story is not one of a bunch of guys who got together in a tavern and put some crap together and slapped a square and compass on it. I think the purpose of it was much more deep than that and much more rich than that, and that it does span thousands of years. So I find comfort in the fact that I'm walking a path, or at least I think I'm walking a path that's been traveled by, again, that select few for thousands upon thousands of years. And that gives me comfort, and it gives me purpose, and it gives me hope in what I do in this fraternity. Because I'll tell you what doesn't give me hope and give me purpose in this fraternity is going to crappy meetings and hearing minutes read and, reading one of these every month. That does not do it for me. So if that's what Freemasonry is, I'll go find something else to do. But like I said, at least I find hope and comfort in the fact that there is a deeper meaning, and it's showing me a path to something better.
I love it. Another question I have here, unless we want to take a question from the audience.
Brother. With the Ogdoad? Yeah. So the question was, do I know or have I read about any rituals regarding the Ogdoad? So I don't. So in my brief reading on the Ogdoad, because everything I kept reading saying, with the rise of the Osirian or, sun god religious system, the Ogdoad kind of went by the wayside. At least in the stuff I read. It looks like you're going to correct me, which is awesome. But they in the stuff that I read, they treated the Ogdoad like the Titans. They were there before, they were doing their thing, and then somebody got a wild hair to create man, and these guys kind of went by the wayside. And as a cult center, when it came to the ancient Egyptian religious systems, at least as far as I've read, they kind of died off by the time of the Second Intermediate period. So around the 1600s, they weren't the top dog anymore, right? So that's why all your city centers that I talked about, had their patron gods as Ra and Thoth and Anubis and Isis, things like that. Indeed, we will. You got another one?
Yeah, let me get Dustin. Yeah, go ahead.
So jumping off the grandfather question, so what, does this have something to do with, obviously, you've been reading on it about what places or people and also not have territory. Does it have to do with emulation of archetypes? You threw out that the mother goddesses and mother gods that they portrayed as you didn't have to over all the human emotions, all human experience, all boiled down to the same thing, or two pieces of tarot or something. Does it have to do with the reason there is that connection? Save more able as this thing can be initiatic practices that God uses to do that thing is a way in Europe for us to learn that sorry. That's what anger is. That's what stoicism is. That's how we boil down to this alchemical process reincorporating these perspectives.
No, it wasn't. And so to restate it for the folks online, you asked the question of, do I look at this and what I presented, do I look at it as providing does it provide a chain of events for us as Freemasons going back to that time? Does it provide those archetypes basically for us to talk about the human condition? You basically answered your own question, because I 1,000% agree with you that looking at these archetypes and these symbols and what they mean, at least as far back as then, can imply some meanings for us today. And if it doesn't, then I think, what's the point then, right? Why are we going to pancake breakfasts and why are we eating green beans all day long? And I joke about it, but I can't tell you how many times I've traveled outside of my state and gone to a lodge and that's all that I see. I'm like, why do you guys get together? What is the purpose? If you want brotherhood, go join this. If you want to go gamble and drink, go join this. But to Scott's point earlier, if you want to, I think the purpose of our craft at the end of the day is to provide us a means by which we can look more into ourselves and hopefully become a better person. So hopefully I answered that question.
So time for one more question.
Okay.
I'm going to get here. It's from Brother Patrick Sands of this lodge. We're going to go from that too. He asks, of the 3 degrees, is there any particular degree which you feel is most important from an initiation experience perspective? If not most important, then at least the most formative. I know there's a couple different esoteric authors who say the 1st degree or the 3rd degree.
Right.
What do you think?
So I kind of have 2 answers for that. So I think, and that's kind of why I harped on the initiatic experience being so important, because I think that drives the rest of your career in Masonry going forward. So for me, that very first initiation, with that first time you go to the West Gate is kind of the most important from an exposure perspective. But in terms of that apotheosis that we talked about, you're raising as a master Mason. That's where all the gravy and the cheddar is right there. And if it's done well, and if it's done in a memorable way, it's something that you take with you for the rest of your life. And if it's done in a crappy way, then, I'm saddened for you that it has. But, those are the 2 formative aspects, first knocking on the door. And again, your raising ceremony should be a game changer in your life. And it should point you towards things that you never considered before. Sir.
I've been doing a little research on the side, just for everybody's reference. If anyone's interested in the program, what Cleopatra's Needle and the Masonic objects found in it, I stand corrected. It was Springfield Lodge number 217 in Springfield, Virginia.
Well, all right, I'm gonna go check them out. So again, right on. Well, thank you so much for your time.
All right. Thank you, brother.
Yeah, it's great. Awesome. All right. Thank you guys so much. We have 7 minutes to Stephen L. Harrison's presentation. I want to express to you, don't miss it, because I will record it, but after 11 months of it being recorded, it will be deleted. Everybody online back in 7 or 6 minutes.